Okay, thanks for joining today. I'm going to go ahead and start the recording. If more folks come um, entry in, I'll hear them and I'll switch over to allow them in. So just excuse me if I have to pause for a second to do that. Let me get this out of the way. So today we're here to talk about automating multi-vendor migrations. And I do have a demo set up to drill down into some of the benefits of using validated content, the new validated content for networking to make it a bit easier. And I have some examples of being able to uh, make the data, the structured data, really the focal point. So as opposed to, oh, here we go. Sorry about that. Let me make sure that worked. Okay. Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, so as opposed to using command lines, which you may or may not be as familiar with one vendor versus another, it's really nice to be able to work through structured data. So the validated content will allow us to ingest structured data so that we can gather the current configuration from a particular vendor's router in this case, and then we can use that data to make that translation. So we can manipulate the data a bit easier. In some cases, the data actually transfers over in terms of like key values, in terms of the structured data being a dictionary. Some of these resource modules that kind of work under the hood here, they have the exact same parameters. Sometimes there are nuances. So what we're going to do is focus in on those diffs, and we'll make the translation where it makes sense. So that way we can very easily convert over a configuration and then apply it from one vendor to another. So before we get into the demo, I wanted to give you a little bit of a backdrop of what we're going to do. And I know this slide's a bit busy, so I'll just kind of walk through it. And if you have any questions, feel free to either raise your hand or you can just unmute yourself and ask me if there's something that's not clear here. So in this demo, I have 5 different routers. So 4 of the routers are Cisco routers, and router 3 is like our target for this migration. So what we want to do is take the configuration as it were for router 3, and we want to be able to, from the perspective of structured data, we want to leverage that, which represents, it's a model of what the command line configuration is for that particular router. Just for informational purposes, these are CSR 1000V, so they're virtual routers, and they're running the iOS XE operating system. So for Juniper, obviously we have Junos, and if you look at the command lines, set commands look, a lot different. And in some cases, there's, proprietary features and, a lot of different nuances between what you'll see in Juniper as opposed to Cisco iOS command line, right? So what we're going to do is abstract away those differences by looking at the structured data, which in fact still has some differences, but it's a bit easier to work in that regard, specifically because we're leveraging the validated content. So I'm going to show you more about the validated content here in a minute, and we'll actually take a look at some of the documentation. So you'll have a good idea of how you may leverage this validated content for this particular use case, but there's other use cases too that you may want to consider that would be a lot easier if you were to use the validated content. So in this particular demo, what we're going to do, and let me admit real quick. Again, sorry about that. So in this demo, we're going to leverage the validated content and specifically the network.base collection. And I'll table like a little bit about the validated content until we go to the interface so you can see it. It'll make more sense that way. But just know that the validated content effectively a role, and you could consider it as a very prescriptive viewpoint in how you would configure a use case. So the use case that in particular that's important for us today in this demo is being able to pull in the configurations, and again, a structured data, And for our purposes, because we're using Ansible, that structured data will become YAML. And as we gather that information, so we're going to gather the information from these devices, even the Juniper device, right, the one that we intend on migrating, it does have a basic configuration so that we can have access to it. So all of these devices are virtual. They're running in AWS, and obviously, you have to have a bit of configuration so that we can connect to them remotely. So we'll see that configuration come back, that very base configuration from the Juniper. However, the Cisco have a more complete configuration. So router 3 will have other components that are not configured in Juniper just yet. So things like OSPF routing and logging and SNMP and a bunch of other configurations as they were on router 3. So we're going to pull them in or gather them and then convert them into YAML files. And those YAML files are stored in the host vars directory. So if you're familiar with host vars, you know that that is one of the locations that Ansible can locate as it's looking to define variables. So just a real quick level set here. So obviously you have an inventory, and it's not best practice to populate your inventory with a bunch of variables, but you could, and usually those are like real high level types of things that apply to maybe all of your devices or all of your groups, those types of things. But more of the specific information kind of makes its way down into group vars. And then host vars would be very specific to that device. So that's what we're creating here with the validated content. In the network.base collection, it has this resource underscore manager role, and that role has roles within it that it uses to go out and gather the configurations. What it'll do is it'll iterate through all of the available resource modules. So resource modules are like my preferred way of making configuration changes in terms of using Ansible for network devices. And these resource modules are fairly intuitive themselves, and they're fairly easy to use. But when you start combining multiple resource modules together, then there's a bit of complexity there. So that's what the validated content is doing, is it's going to list out the resource modules. It's going to look, and if there's configurations for a particular resource module that is supported by this device, it's going to collect that, gather that information, and then create a YAML file under host vars. So once we have those host vars in our repository, so that's kind of another layer of consideration here, is that we're using a repository to store all of our content in terms of playbooks, templates, the configuration files. All of those are being pulled in from a repository to have content available for our automation controller. So the automation controller pulls down that content, but what happens when we run a playbook, or in this case, because we have the automation controller, a job template that maps to a playbook that makes a change, as is the case here, because now we're creating these files, we need to push those files into the Git repository. So that adds, additional considerations in terms of credentials, right? Because normally, like in a public repository, you can just clone down that information, and that's effectively what we're doing with the AAP. We, pull in that project. We have, all of the available playbooks, for that particular branch, in that repo. But when we make a change, we can only make changes locally. If we want to push a change to that remote origin, in this case, GitLab, then we have to log in. And, once we're authenticated, then we can push those changes into that repo. So that's what we have. And you'll see this. I'll show you what it looks like in my particular playbooks, how we're able to, clone down, make changes to files, add them into our local repo that's running in our local environment, which is the execution environment, commit those changes, and then push them, back into the repo. Now those are the available files, or the configuration files, that we can use in our automation workflows. So the next step that we have is, I want to migrate router 3 configuration to the Juniper router. So in order to do that, a lot of the resource modules and the parameters that are a part of those modules do translate over, but some of them don't. So it does require a little bit of a data manipulation, if you will. And in order for me to do that, That's outside of the scope of what the validated content or this resource manager role can do. So what I'm doing is I've added like an additional step using Jinja 2 templates. And it's really just to handle those diffs so I can move, pull in that data, structured data, modify it where needed, and then create a new configuration file that ultimately I want to push to the Juniper router. And once I modify those configuration files in my host vars directory, I can use the validated content with the action of deploy to make that configuration change. So I don't have to deal with all the resource modules individually. I can still take advantage of that role that will orchestrate, a lot of that for me in a prescriptive way. So when we collect the information and create those files, it's persist, or the action is persist. And we'll look at the documentation. So just table that for a second. And then the action deploy is when we want to make a configuration change. There's other actions because there's different states that we can leverage, just like we can with the resource module. So some of the other states are where deploy really equates to merge, the state of merge. And persist is kind of a little bit different of an animal, but mainly it's like gather, but then you're writing a configuration file. So those are just two of the actions that we can take. So I'll walk through what some of the other actions are, because there's actually built-in configuration drift and other capabilities that make that are very easy to implement using the validated content. So having said all that, I just want to show you some things that you'll have access to these links as part of a PDF that I'll post, in the event, the post. If you go back to these events after they occur, it'll say past event in Meetup. And then you can go into them, and I always include the links to slide decks, to the recording, to any of like the Git repos that we use for the particular topic. So you'll have access to these. But in particular, one that I do want to point out is that this network.base blog really explains and gives some good examples of how to use those actions. And I'm going to show you what it looks like in the documentation. So from like the outside, like a public view of the validated content, that's not available yet on this site, but it is coming within a month from now. You'll be able to see validated content. Currently, if you go to this link, you'll see the certified collections. And the certified collection, or certified, this should say certified collection, not content. The certified collections, they're similar to what you see on Galaxy. Like that's the community version of the collections. But as you use the Ansible Automation Controller as a customer, then you have access to the certified collections. From this link, you can see like which ones are available. Hold on a second. Let me just let this person in. And soon you'll be able to see the validated content. So the current way to see the validated content is you have to have a login. So if you don't have a login to any of this stuff, you do have some options. So one of the options that I don't think I have a link, let me look on the next slide, is a developer license. Yeah, I don't have that one on here, but I'll add that link into this past event as well, because what you can do is create a developer account if you don't already have one. And that'll give you some limited access to run an AAP controller. I think it's up to 20 devices. And that would also give you the ability to see the certified content or certified collections and the validated content. So if you have a login, what you can do is what I'm going to show you here is you can go into what we call the automation hub, and you'll have access to all of this, all these collections. So one of the things, and let me step it back a little bit. So this is what it looks like in the private automation hub. So this is effectively in my lab environment. I have a controller, and this is a second VM that I'm running the private automation hub. It can pull in from the Red Hat console updates to all of the certified collections and the validated content. So here you can see on the screen, I have everything says validated. So these are validated content. You can use different filters to be able to get to those. So like if you go into here, I could select Red Hat certified, and this shows me all the certified collections. So remember, a collection is different. A collection is the modules, right? The modules is really that Python code that's running behind your playbooks, right? Because like the playbook is like the front end. It's it is the YAML file, right, where you're defining parameters. And when you run through a playbook, you have plays and you have tasks, but really on the back end, there's Python code that's actually creating, through that connection, that SSH connection to these network devices, it's creating the serialized data that you're going to send, which is typically the native command lines. Or in the case of Juniper, it's netconf, but it's not the YAML. You're not sending like the YAML as serialized data across the line. It's on the back end of invoking those modules. So that's what you see in a certified collection is a collection of the modules, right? And also it could include some roles, and it could include what does include the documentation, some example playbooks. Those are the things that typically you would expect to find in a certified collection. In the validated content, it's a bit different. So when I go back to here, and why is it not letting me go like that? Let me put validated in here. Yeah, so in the validated, and in particular, today, the one that we're looking at is the network.base right here. What this is really like a very smart collection of roles. So you can think of it as like the resource manager is like this high level role that has access to all these other roles. And if you're not familiar with roles, roles are really like a purpose built playbook that maps to a particular use case, right? So you can create a playbook and use it over and over again and make changes to it. And it may work for your purposes, but if you want to make it more shareable, right, and be able to repurpose it for other people on your team, typically you're going to want to convert that into a role. And then a role would be very variabilized, and the role itself is, very cohesive. It's very scoped to a particular use case, and you don't want it to do too much. You want it to, be very modular. And so, having said that, what you'll see here is like a role that calls other roles. And that's where it starts to abstract and take away a lot of complexity because you don't have to build any of these playbooks or even these roles from scratch. And it gives you a lot of capabilities out of the box. So hold on a second. Let me let this person in. And yeah, so you should still see my playbook. I mean, my slide here. Yeah, so let me, you know what? I think I was just sharing the tab. So when I went over to this automation hub, I don't think you were seeing that, right? So let me stop sharing for a second and go back here. I'm just going to share my desktop so I don't forget to move that around. Just give me a second to share again, if you don't mind. Let's share the whole deal. All right. And let me let this person in. All right. So you should be seeing the endless screens right now. So I'll go back to the automation hub that we were looking at, or I was looking at. So this is the automation hub. Let me just walk that back in case you didn't see what I was talking about. So I'll go back to like the landing page again. So here, like I mentioned, the validated, these are all validated contents. Here's one for networking, network.bgp, but it has a dependency on the base. So really you start from the base and then there's other use cases that fall underneath that umbrella. So BGP being one of those, OSPF, there's one for backups. So really there's a lot of good stuff going on to make it very easy to implement using this validated content. And then what I did is I went into the base and I just want to walk through some of the documentation real quick. So today what we're going to see is I'm going to use this action persist. So the action kind of maps to like a state does in the resource modules, but it does a lot more than that too because it is going to stitch together multiple roles. But in this particular action, this is the one where it's going to gather the configuration and it's going to save it as configuration files under host vars. So, that's the whole, the premise of this demo. And these are the resource modules that it's going to look for configurations. So you can list those out, right? Because there's tons of resource modules. These are the ones that are explicitly called out as variables in this particular task, right? And the role that it's using is this resource manager role. Now, some differences here that you'll see a data store. So I'm using a local data store in mine because I'm saving that information to the execution environment, and then I'm using some other playbook tasks to push it to my GitHub or my GitLab repository. You could use this one here, also works with the Git repositories, but this one builds a branch. So I didn't want to add the extra step of CI. So if you're familiar with like GitOps and all that stuff, when you create these new branches and commit them to your remote origin, in this case for me it's GitLab, then that branch is completely separate from like my main branch. So if I want to take this updated information, if I want to to have it promote it to my main branch, if you will, then I'm going to have to merge it. In GitHub, you do a PR, a pull request. So that's just, GitHub is pull request, and GitLab uses a merge or a merge request. So instead of adding those steps, what I'm doing is I'm just sending mine to the main branch just to skip that piece of it. So that's, if I did want to create a new branch, then it would use this one. And what this is doing is under the hood, it's using the Ansible.scm module. So that one is, this role is calling that module. And you don't see any of that because, again, it's all abstracted to make it easier. So that was persist. We're also going to use deploy. So deploy will actually make the configuration changes. So in this case, they just want to change interfaces and layer 2 interfaces in this example, right? And then there's some other actions, right? So gather, it's similar to persist. It goes out and gathers, the facts specific to each one of those resource modules that you list out, but it doesn't create a file. So that's where persist and gather are different. Persist will create the files that you could use as host variables. Gather will just bring it back and you'll see it on the screen, or you can register it into memory as part of a task. So for your purposes, you might use gather like to verify, the configuration change that you made, and you may run that in like a read-only mode just to see what the config is and pull that back. So that's a different use case, right? So detect, this one is allowing you to see if there's a configuration difference, right? So this is a drift check between what you have in your configuration files and what's actually running in the device, right? So you can do a quick check and you can see what the difference is. So that way, if you went out and learned those configurations and gathered them at some point, but somebody's went out outside of automation, perhaps, out of band, and connected to those same devices and made a configuration change, then you may want to know that, ingest it, or actually overwrite it, right? Depending on what's going on. So you can leverage these actions. So detect will tell you like the diffs, but if you want to go a step beyond that, you can use the action of remediate. And then remediate will go out and override whatever is the configuration on the device. So that would say, make the configuration based off of the configuration files, in terms of what Ansible has access, and overwrite that configuration, or, remove that extra configuration as it exists on that device. So you can use that as a remediation, but just be careful with those because some of the configurations on your networking devices, you want to be careful, like access list or VLANs, that you don't actually remove something that needs to be there. So you probably want to start, by running it more in the read-only way, the detect, right? And you can think of this as very similar to how you can just run your playbooks in general in like a check mode. And then when you run it in run mode, if you have a state like replaced or override, then it's actually going to make that change. So just keep that in mind, that it works similar to that. So you still have the ability, again, like I'm not saying like you need to use the validated content and roles for everything, but for a lot of the use cases, like 80% of the way that you would normally use them, then they're pretty good out of the box. But if you want to do something very specific, then you would just go in with like directly using your resource modules. And then you can change state and you can be, much more granular in what you want to do. But a lot of these use cases are meant to like, for the things that it makes sense, it's very easy and effectively out of the box, or like a really low code way of getting started. So I think I covered, list. Yeah, so list will tell you which resource modules are available. So this is just a quick check based off of the device and the iOS, in this case, Cisco iOS, or whatever image that it's running, whatever software that's running for that particular vendor. It'll list out the resource modules that are relevant for that device, but it doesn't do anything. It just lists them out. Like these are the ones that that make sense for that device. And yeah, that's about it. So those are the actions. So actions are kind of like state, but state is underneath that, right, in the resource module. And then the action is a part of the resource manager role. And then how you can, leverage this particular role to either save configs, read configs, change configs, or determine if there's a drift, or remediate if there was a drift, if your policy, is such that, you want to overwrite those differences in configurations. So I said a lot there. I think we're at a point where we can jump into the demo, but what I want to do is just pause real quick and just make sure there's not any questions on any of that stuff before I actually show you it working live. So if you do have a question, feel free to raise your hand. There should be a hand raised in here somewhere. And if not, you can unmute yourself as well. Okay, so I'll assume we can move forward. So let's go ahead and look at my GitLab. So in the GitLab here, you can glean. I have several different files, and one thing I do want to point out is the host vars, right? So this is a project, right? It's validated-network-EE. This gives me access, to the validated content in the sense that I do have an execution environment that I created that I'm running in my automation controller, and then the roles that I'm using there have access to all of the other roles that are necessary and other collections and things like that. So in this particular project, the roles that I'm creating here are for our purposes. So I just want to point out these are not the validated content roles. These are roles that I created. And in particular, a lot of these are actually not even relevant for this demo, but I just wanted to point out that these are different. So what we care about is the host vars at the moment. And you'll notice that all I have here is this Juniper underscore RDR, so just a Juniper router. And I have this .git keep, so that way this folder remains. And I've actually removed any of the contents for that particular one. Let me let this person in real quick. Sorry about that. So we're just kind of starting from. I just want to show that we're starting from a clean slate. Let me get back. Sorry, dude, this pop-up thing gets in the way. All right, admit. All right, so yeah, so back to my GitLab. Yeah, so all we have under host vars is a Juniper router, but we don't have, at this particular state in the demo, we don't have any of the configuration files from the Cisco routers, and we really don't even have any files for the Juniper router. It's just the folder here, right? So I just went ahead and deleted its contents and deleted those other routers. So what I want to do is I want to learn the configurations as they are right now. But before I do that, I just want to show you here from the command line. And let me move this out of the way. Yeah, it's still connected. You can see I have this Juniper router prompt right here. And what I want to do is just look at the existing configuration. And I'm just using set commands. It's a little bit easier, in my opinion, to look at it this way than the JSON configuration. So we can see that at this point, just to call out some of the things that don't currently exist. There's no SNMP configuration. There's no logging host configuration. There's no IPs configured on some of the interfaces that we're going to use. What else? The OSPF is missing. So there's a lot of configuration that's missing. It's really just some of the things that I needed to have in here so that I can remotely connect to it. So that's the state of the Juniper router right now. The Cisco routers have a full configuration. We just haven't learned it yet. So what we're going to do is go into my automation controller. And I'm going to turn off my video because my controller is actually running on my laptop. And I think that caused me some problems last time. So I'm just going to shut that off to free up a little bit more of the resources. So what I want to do is go into my templates And then under this account, I only have like the pertinent content in the AAP controller that we need for this demo. So I'm using, roles-based access just so you don't have to see like all of the different demos and clutter that I have in this controller. And what I want to do first is use persist. So if you recall, the network.base persist, that will gather the configs from all the devices that are in my groups that I'm going to call out of my inventory, and it's going to pull down those configurations. So I'm going to run that, and then I'll show you in GitLab, what's going on from a playbook perspective. So I'll go ahead and run that one, and what it's doing right now is it's just pulling down the code from the repo, and now it's actually running the playbook. And I can see that also from a notification that pops up on the screen for my Slack chat ops. So it's going to run this playbook. So while that's happening, let's jump over here to this tab. And what I want to show you is the persist playbook, right? So here's the persist playbook. Now, some of this stuff I mentioned earlier where I need to pull down the files from Git to my execution environment. And if you're not familiar with an execution environment, the current way that we run automation and execute it from Ansible using the Ansible automation platform is that we have a container. And the container is called the execution environment. And in that container, it typically includes all of the collections and any other dependencies that we need are wrapped into that container. The old way to do this was creating a virtual environment, a Python virtual environment on a device. And if you're using just the Ansible core engine, you can still do that. But if you're using Ansible Navigator, the newer command line tool, N2E, or the controller, then you'll use these execution environments. So what I'm doing is I'm pulling in the files, I'm cloning them down, creating this directory. And then from that, I'm working in these tasks. So this task here is our interaction, including this role for the resource manager. And in the variables, I'm saying, go ahead and look in all these various resource modules and pull in any configs that map to any of these, and then store them locally. And then what I'm doing here is I'm actually going through the git commands on my execution environment and ultimately pushing those file changes back to my repository. So if you recall in the repository before we ran that job template, we didn't have any host variables defined yet, right? So if I look back here just to see what's going on here, we can see that it's still running. But just to point out a couple of things in the output, you can see that I have these diffs turned on. So the before state was no file with no contents. So we can see what's being added, right? So the after is showing like the configurations that are being added. And you can see that it's not adding command line configurations. It's adding structured data, right? So each one of these resource modules has a name. And that is also the name of the dictionary that we're creating in these configuration files. So this logging global, and then you can see that we have structured data. So sometimes it's a dictionary, a list elements, or just a list or another dictionary. So all of that structure is the exact same as you'll see in the documentation for that particular module. And it's coming in, and then we're saving it as a file. So as I scroll down, you'll see that it is iterating through like all our devices. And then ultimately, it's going to complete and update those files. So right here, we see that we went through the git command. So it pushed, right, committed and pushed those files to our GitLab repo. So I go back to the GitLab repo, and I'll go into host vars. Actually, let me refresh this. Right, and you can see we have a little bit of information now in Juniper. And if I go back, we also have router 1, router 2, and router 3, and router 4. If you joined the session earlier, I went through a slide and said that router 3 is where we're going to convert configurations over to the Juniper router. And you can see we have several different resource modules that were pulled back because they had configurations that map to those resource modules. So if we look here, like in host name, it's router 3 on this one. But if we look at Juniper, we already had a host name, but it's not the one that we want. So when we convert it over, we want to change the host name, right? So it's going to change from Juniper_router to router 3. So there's a change that we need to make. And then other stuff here was just real basic things. Like the interfaces are obviously going to be different on the Juniper, the naming convention. And layer 3 interfaces at this point don't have IP addresses assigned to them. right? So just the management interface, but none of these other ones. So we need to fix those as well. But when we look at router 3, it has all that information, right? So here's the layer 3 information with the IP addressing. The access list doesn't apply, so we're not going to move that over. This is just an access list for the actual what's it called, the guest shell. Yeah, so the guest shell thing was set up and it had an access list for that, but that doesn't apply to Juniper, so that one's not going to go over. So we're only going to list out the ones that we want to map over, and I'll show you what that looks like here momentarily as well. But things like OSPF, SNMP needs to come over. So all these configs that need to come over, we're going to go through and convert them. So at this point, we haven't made any configuration changes to the Juniper. And in order to do that, what we want to do is we want to go through our migration step. So if I go back to the automation controller into my templates, I have this validated migration. So this is where I'm taking those files that we pulled in from the validated content, and I'm going to use some templates to do a bit of data manipulation. So I'm going to go ahead and run this one, and then we'll take a look at what that is, the actual Jinja 2 templates. So we'll go ahead and kick this one off. So we got a notification with our job number. So this one will start here in a second. And you can see the same thing. We have a diff here. So anywhere that I'm making a configuration change, you can see that. Right, so like the host as an example. So that one went pretty quick because the Jinja 2 templates are fairly simple, and they actually have pretty good performance, so they go through pretty fast. So we made some changes, and then we pushed those changes to the repo. So if I go back to the repo at this point, I'll go into host vars, and let's refresh that screen. And we'll look at Juniper. You can see that now I have additional resource modules, right? In the beginning, all I had was like the couple interface ones in the host name. And you can see in the host name, it's changed to router 3, as expected. Interfaces, that's pretty much the same as it was. But the layer 3 didn't have IP addresses. Now it does. So, we moved over the IP addressing that was used for router 3. And we didn't have SNMP. Right, so all these configs were a part of that process. So how did that work? So if I go back into our GitLab to templates, you can see that I have created a template with the same naming as the resource modules. Right, so I have these templates in here. So how do we call the templates? So let me go back and start from the beginning. So this is that migrate configs playbook that is called from the migrate job template, right? So I can show you how that maps through just real quick too. So when we ran this thing, let me go back to details and then this job template, and you can see that it maps to this playbook here. So that's where we are right now. So I'll go back here and open up this playbook. Right, so the same thing, we pull down files from Git and all that stuff. But what's interesting here is what I'm doing here with this include vars is this is giving me access to these files that are pulled down to my execution environment. I want to open this up to the host vars for router 3. So that gives Ansible, it points Ansible into that directory to look for variables. So in router 3, we had like all those different resource module files. So I didn't want to list each one of those out directly, right? Explicitly call them all out. So if you point this way, then you can actually open up the entire folder, right? So that's what we're doing. And we're just looking for any of the YAML files with the YAML extension, which were in there. So those are all in play and we can search through those. So what we're doing here is I'm iterating through each one of these templates. Right, so what happens is I'm using the same naming as the resource modules, just like we called them out in the validated content, and then we call them out here, and then we're just adding, for the source, we're adding the Jinja 2 extension, the J2. So that's our source, with this name. And then the destination is creating the YAML file in the Juniper_router directory in host vars, right? So we're just creating those YAML files. but we're manipulating the data where needed, right? So once they're there, they're committed and pushed back to the repo, and then they're ready to be pushed to the device, which we haven't done yet. We haven't pushed the configuration change yet. So if we look in the Juniper, it's still just sitting there with that same configuration that we looked at earlier, right? So no SNMP, none of that stuff. So just before we do that, or actually I can do it at the same time, I'll take you through some of the templates as we run the playbook. So I go back to my templates, and this time I want the deploy, the validated network deploy. And it's basically just like persist, except for this time, instead of reading in configurations, it's going to push configurations. So we'll kick that off. And then while that's running, we'll jump over here, and then I'll go into the templates again. All right, so here's host name. And what you can see here is we're just pulling in the host name from the other configuration, the router 3 configuration, right? So basically all this is some parsing. So this one's pretty straightforward. So this is what we're creating. So the host name and the value that's coming in from router 3, right? And then that will be host name colon router 3 is what we'll see in the configuration file, right? So this one's pretty simple for that particular manipulation of the data. Some of the other ones are a little bit more complicated. So let's look at logging. All right, so in logging, on the Cisco side, the parameter is actually called name. So if you want to define like your if you set up logging and then you have that host that you want to send your logging to, your syslogging to, then Cisco in their resource module and structured data, then that key is called name, but the key is called host. But in the Juniper, it's called name. So this is the configuration that we're setting up in that YAML file. So all I'm doing is I'm pointing to, that value that's under host, just like it is here, but on the router 3. So to kind of make sense there, it's like if we look at router 3, and I just kind of have to jump between the two. Maybe I should open up more tabs of this. But like if I go into router 3, right, and we were looking at SNMP, right? No, we were looking at the logging. I'm sorry. Logging. Where is the logging? Logging, global. Right, so you can see that we call it host for the parameter, and then it's host for the specific host because it's a list of hosts, right? So we call it host here, but in our other one, in Juniper, it calls it name. So in Juniper logging, it's name. So to manipulate that data and parse it from the source, which is the router 3, the Cisco, and then move it over, then I had to create that parsing of the data. So that's where we were looking at the template. So back to templates, and where are you at? Logging, right? So that's all we're doing is a bit of data manipulation. If it was something that we really need to iterate, like through a lot of these, we could use map to attributes and things like that. But these are pretty straightforward. We're just taking the thing and just renaming the key when we create the configuration file. And then pretty much I had to do that across the board anywhere where there was a difference. So how did I learn the differences? So one way that you can do that is you could command line configure a Juniper and then use the the validated content, right, to pull down that configuration, and you'll see those configuration files and you'll see the exact structure. Or you can go to the actual documentation, right? So if you go to the resource modules documentation, it will show you that entire dictionary. So you can kind of do a diff between those two. You can actually open them up like on GitHub, and you can look at them and do it that way. But again, a lot of times, there's not that many nuances. So it really just depends on how many different things you're configuring. But once you go through that exercise once, and then you have that data structure that you need to migrate, from one to the other, then it's very repeatable, right? Because it's not going to change. They're going to continue to use the same key names and things like that moving forward. So once you have that, create those simple Jinja 2 templates, then you're good to go. So you'll save a lot of time, because trying to do that and wrap your head around the command lines is kind of hard, because they're very different. And if you're not as skilled with Cisco over Juniper, one way or the other, then it's going to be a taller, you know, hill to climb. So that barrier to getting it done is a lot higher. So this really does help make it very easy, because you really don't even have to understand the command lines at all. You're just comparing data. So I'm sitting there, and at this point, we ran this, and you can see again, when I ran that resource module, this time in deploy, using the action of deploy, it goes through, and then at the end, you can see that it starts showing the differences in what it's changing, right, from what was in the configuration of the Juniper and what changed. So you can click on these and you can see them, in a JSON mode here, or you can see, the output on the screen, and you can see, these are the parameters that were changed. And then what we can do is now we can look at the Juniper, and you can see like we have an IP address here now for our tunnel. We have some OSPF configuration now. We have this SNMP community string configured that was on router 3. Now it exists on the Juniper router. We changed the host name to router 3. And in the logging, we changed or created a host for the syslog logging. So here I didn't do too many of the modules just to keep it simple, but it's really just rinse and repeat. It would be the exact same exercise, moving forward with any of the resource modules. Now, if you get into areas where there's not a resource module, then your fallback then would be Jinja templates anyway. So sometimes you may have a Jinja 2 template that's very specific for the particular device, because there is no resource module and there's no similarity, from a structured data perspective. So those will kind of be like your one-off things that typically I would attack them later. But most of the main features and functions of these devices are encapsulated or covered under that umbrella of the resource modules. It's normally like the more proprietary things or the advanced configurations, like MPLS, like some of those things usually would send you more into using Jinja templates anyway. But for a lot of the things that you're doing, the validated content makes it very easy to, at a minimum, right, just to be able to easily pull in configurations that haven't been automated before, and then easily convert them into automation. And then also, if you have the need to go from one device to another, or if you have a multi-demo environment, to be able to deal with the structured data and those differences, as opposed to living in differences in the whole, paradigm of this command line world where, you'll have a headache trying to remember syntax and things of that nature. So that is the demo. So let me go back to the screen here and pause and see if there are any questions on anything you saw, or if you need me to bring up any particular screens to actually elaborate or clarify any of what you saw. So I'll pause now and I'll shut up. And if you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself, or you can ask in the chat room. And I'll throw out a question too, from my viewpoint. So if you want to, you can just use like one of the emojis, the thumbs up or whatever. Yeah, just use the thumbs up. How many of you have a multi-vendor network environment? Does anybody? And in that environment, is it automated at all? Not yet. Do you have plans on moving in that direction? Cool. Okay. Well, I hope this gave you a little bit of ideas in that regard. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to shut this recording off, and then for those of you that want to stay on, I'm going to start another recording for a short session of the study group to go through a hands-on lab on filter plugins. So if you're interested in that, I'm going to go ahead and switch gears into that and bring up my my study guide and walk through some of that stuff. So let me go ahead and shut this off. And again, thank you for joining this. If you do have to drop off.